there is an extremely strong correlation between the position of the idiosyncratic spellings in the Cairo edition and earlier Quranic manuscripts. I would like to add a comment on this. We may imagine by examining this in the earlier codex and comparing with the Cairo edition, we may imagine that the Cairo edition is an intentional and successful return to form of the original rasm. But I think, with all respect to your opinion, it is not. In fact, when the Al-Azhar specialists convened to produce a reliable edition of the Quran towards 1920, they never thought of looking for the earliest written witnesses. Rather, they just rely on what sources like Al-Muqni by Abu Amr al-Dani say about the masahif rasm. Even writing of Ibrahim without ya in Surah Al-Baqarah, or for example, shay without alif in all mushafs except for one instance in Surah Al-Kahf, وَلَا تَقُولَنَّ لِشَيْءٍ, and so on, is according to al-Dani's reports, I think. But such claims are not corroborated whatsoever by early Quranic manuscripts, in which, for example, the orthographic form shay appears as shay everywhere. And that's it. Marijn, could you please share your thoughts with us about this? I would like to know your opinions on this. Thank you very much.
Let's first talk a little bit about the Cairo edition, actually. Okay. So it's true, of course, that the rasm that we see in say the standard text and all standard texts are not based on manuscripts, but are indeed, based on these masahif works, rasm works, whatever you like to call them. And Al-Muqni clearly played an important role in how it is formed. And very often when we see something strange about the Cairo edition compared to manuscripts we're used to, it's because it's in Al-Muqni or some other works, but mostly there. And but I would say that, looking at these medieval works, they are, although they clearly get some things very wrong and strangely wrong, like the shay example that you mentioned, they also get a lot right. It is a little mysterious, I think, sometimes to wonder how it got some of these things right and how it got some of these things wrong. And that must have something to do with the sources that they were consulting, and that the kind of manuscripts that we are looking at, so the really ancient ones, were not necessarily the ones that, say, al-Dani was looking at, who was probably looking at slightly later manuscripts, maybe manuscripts more typical for Al-Andalus or the Maghreb at the time, which may have had more advanced orthographies, these kinds of things. And so we kind of get this kind of a pretty good match to some extent, but to some extent we also get a mismatch. The mismatch is nowhere near as big as what we would find in, say, Ottoman manuscripts, which have completely classicized spelling, or even the Ibn al-Bawwab Quran, beautiful complete Quran that is in the Chesabiti library, which is pretty early. It's 4th century, so it's 1000 CE, and that already has fully classicized spelling. This whole pattern of clearly reproducing the spellings is gone in that manuscript. So clearly these works are closer to say the original rasm than some later manuscripts are. So the masahif works are closer to the rasm than probably even a lot of manuscripts were at the time. Maybe not so much in the Maghreb, but in the Mashriq, I would say so. Now, when it comes to the question of the alif, it's hard. So clearly, when these works, these masahif rasm works, talk about the spelling of the alif, that doesn't really seem to correspond very well with what we actually see in manuscripts. Some things it gets right, like al-kitab is usually written without an alif. That's true. I mean, it's very hard to find manuscripts where it is written with an alif. But the very specific, there's one exception thing, we don't see that. Same with shape. Well, it's the other way around. But so you get these odd exceptions and odd rules that are formulated in these masahif works, which well, don't show up in manuscripts. At the same time, some general rules do work out, right? So like fa'ilun type active participles in the plural and fa'ilat never have the alif in the first syllable, and that's mostly right. In some later Kufic manuscripts, say 3rd, 4th century, you do start seeing them there, but you don't see that in the 1st century. And these descriptions basically get that right, which is surprising in some ways. So there's clearly something there. There's clearly a system going on there. But at the same time, I mean, some of these alifs are just chaos. So there are places where you look at, like, is this word written with an alif or without an alif? And you just don't get a consistent answer between manuscripts. I think there are some patterns, and Déroche kind of hints at this in his work, especially his 2009 and 2014 books, where he looks into the spelling of i'bad and qala and these kinds of things, and generally notices that ibad tends to be written with an alif more in somewhat later manuscripts. Same thing with whether qala is written qaf alif lam or just qaf lam. So there seems to be a kind of a temporal thing going on there. But sometimes you do find very early manuscripts that use alif, and then you go to later manuscripts and the alif is gone. So there's not an absolute directionality to this. There's a general trend, but it's very dangerous to say, well, this word is written with an alif, therefore this manuscript must be later, right? Some alifs start disappearing after a while, like in the early manuscripts, as I'm sure you know, dhu would always be written as dal, waw, alif.
Yes.
Later on, they start writing it with dal, waw, right? And the alif is gone. And that's what we see in the Cairo edition. The alif is gone. So what do we do with that? It's hard. So what I hope to find when I think the alifs are actually a very important key to better understanding the transmission history of the Quran. I would imagine that if we would really take all these manuscripts and start comparing them across each other, we will start seeing bundles of, okay, this group of manuscripts writes these words with an alif and these words without, and this group generally does it here, or they make an exception exactly this place, and they probably copy these kind of things pretty carefully as well. But there was more variation across, say the Islamic worlds, how he did this and what the solutions were for that, and how free people felt to change those spellings where they didn't feel it with others. There probably would be some kind of clustering going on, and we could say, okay, this alif use is typical for this group of manuscripts, and this alif use is typical for this group of manuscripts. And that would tell us a lot about say, the microstematics. We have a kind of general sense, of ḥuthmanic archetype, and then Assyrian Codex and the Basran Codex, Kufan and Medinan. But I think the alifs might hold a key to get a more higher resolution look at that. Case in the Quran article that I wrote together with Philip Stokes, I also had, jaza'uhu, and jaza'uhum, and whether that's written with alif waw and then ha, or just alif and ha. And that's a pattern that we don't find in the Cairo edition at all. But there is clearly a pattern there in early manuscripts. I looked at like 8, I think, at the time, compared them across each other. And even there you see these kinds of, clearly somehow correlated spellings, which do not get recorded by the tradition, but do clearly get copied very carefully in these early manuscripts. In general, I think the pattern for these is very stable across early manuscripts. Quite different.
I agree with you. You. It can be seen that a large number of masahif follow the same convention. It's obvious. But however, variant instances are also numerous. There are many variant instances that are not follow this pattern.